Hello, I'm Graham and I hope everyone's having a great day. Welcome to part 2 in this new video tutorial series for new users of the Canon EOS M50 mirrorless camera. Incidentally, that's the camera that I'm filming the sequence with at the moment. Now, in this video, I'm looking at shooting in the program auto mode, or P mode as it's known on the mode dial. Now, the P mode is the first step forward before breaking you free of shooting in the fully auto mode. Now, if you're new to the camera, there's nothing wrong with trying out the fully auto mode. It gives you the feel for how the camera performs under various lighting situations. But you'll find that in some situations you haven't got the control that you really need to create the images that you're probably looking for. Now, in the program auto mode, it's the same as the fully auto mode in many respects, but it does take away the fact that the camera is not using scene type dependency for getting the image correct. So in program auto mode, the camera still determines the exposure, but you can actually change the way the camera responds. So for example, if you're shooting a landscape, you want more depth of field, so you need to use a smaller aperture. If you're shooting a portrait, you might want to use a very shallow depth of field, such as I'm using in this particular video. I'm shooting with an aperture of f1.4 on this 32mm lens. So that gives me a nice shallow depth of field, and it throws the background out of focus, which is nice if you want to separate your subject from your background. So we're looking at the program auto mode, how you set that up, what other factors are involved, such as the metering and the focusing. So we'll set the camera up on a tripod so we can actually film the back of the camera while we're reviewing how the program auto mode works. Well, we're currently in the fully auto mode, and that's indicated by the fact that we've got the IA plus symbol marked on the LCD screen here, and the IA, or the A, is aligned with the white index mark on the top of the camera. Now, in the fully auto mode, we do get some provision to modify the image, and that is done with the icon on the bottom right hand side of the screen. Now that brings up the option to use some presets which Canon have devised. So if you touch preset, you can see that we can have vivid, soft, warm, cool, green and various shades, or we can actually use the facility of the camera to change the background blur. So at the moment it's on automatic and it's focused on the subject, but if we want to change that to a manual operation, we can go from blurred, which means we're setting a wider aperture, to sharp, which is a small aperture. So if we set it to sharp, you can see that the background now is much sharper in the background here than it is if we go to blur. So it's changing the aperture from the minimum of this lens, which is f6.3. I'm using the 18-150 lens with the camera, to f16 when it's shooting in the sharp mode. So we're actually effectively controlling the aperture in this particular mode. So if we go back to the blurred setting, we can also change the brightness. So if we click into brightness, this is really exposure compensation. So if the camera metering circuit is under metering, so for example if you were shooting on snow or sand, the camera is likely to underexpose your subject because of the brightness of the background. So in that case you can actually use this control here to change the way the camera operates. So if it was too bright, you can make it darker by going over to the left hand side. You can see that darkens the image. Or if it was too dark, you can move to the right hand side, which brightens the image. In the center is no control. We've also got control over the contrast, so if you wanted to change the way that the image is being recorded, if you were in a dull overcast situation, you might want to make your image appear to be more contrasty, and that way you can move the image over to the right hand side here. You can see that this image is now becoming more contrasty than the default in the middle. So you can use that to improve the contrast. We put that back to the center. There's also a saturation, so if we go over to the saturation slider, if you wanted to pop the colors a little bit more, you can move over to the verd to make the colors a little bit more intense. Let's change now to the program auto mode, and to do that we turn the top mode dial so that the P aligns with the index mark on the top of the camera. When you do that, of course, you'll get confirmation with the P appearing on the LCD screen. Now, program auto mode uses the same logic as the fully auto mode, except it doesn't use scene type dependency. So the fact that you're shooting a landscape or a baby or a dog, it won't make any difference to the camera. It won't change any of the parameters because the subject scene type has changed. So that's really up to you to be able to recognize that and act accordingly. Now, if for example you wanted a shallow depth of field, you're going to have to use a wider aperture. If you wanted to arrest subject motion blur, you're going to need to use a faster shutter speed. Now, the Program Auto mode supports what's called fully auto ISO. So as the lighting changes, the camera will adjust the ISO for you. If I half depress the shutter button at the moment, you'll see that the camera has determined the exposure for this particular scene to be 1/250th of a second, f6.3, and the ISO is 200. Now notice that it's set a reasonably high shutter speed. Now the lens that's on the camera at the moment is the 18-150, and I've got it set at 150mm. So that 1/250th of a second will arrest any handshake and reduce any subject motion blur. So it's an intelligent choice made by the camera. If I take this first shot, you'll see the amount of depth of field. I've got this owl here, nicely sharp, and the background is reasonably out of focus. So let me just take that first picture so we can have a look at that. So that's the one at f6.3. Now, if I wanted more depth of field, if I want to include more of my background to be sharp, say for example I was taking a landscape and I wanted everything from the foreground to the background to be sharp, then I would need to be using a smaller aperture. Now to achieve that, I would turn the front control dial to the left, and that will decrease the aperture. So I've gone from f6.3 to f11 down to this lens will actually support f40. Now with f40, you notice that the shutter speed has dropped to 1/8 of a second. So if I was hand holding this camera, that would be too slow and I would end up with subject motion blur. If you're on a tripod, there's no problem. Now if I wanted to increase the shutter speed so I don't get subject motion blurred, then I would have to change from auto ISO to a manual ISO and change this to something like ISO 1600. And you notice now that my shutter speed is 1/800 at f11. If I go back to the control of the aperture and I go down to f40 again, we're down to 1/60th of a second. So again, that would be too slow for this particular lens. So I need to increase my ISO again. So I need to go to ISO 3200 to get me back to about 1/125th. So we'll go to 3200. And you can see now that I've achieved that 1/125th at f40. So let's take that picture. And you can see the difference in the amount of depth of field between the one at f40 and the one at f6.3. Now don't forget, by using that small aperture, we'll enter into what's called diffraction, and you'll get a slightly softer image. Also, with using the ISO of 3200, we're getting into the realms where the camera will be introducing noise onto your image. So I would say never use anything more than f22 and never use more than ISO 1600, and you'll get some perfect images. So let's re-look at this and let's change this to let's change to f22. Let's drop the ISO again so I can come down to a 1/25th. So I want to come down 2 stops, so I'm going to go down from 3200 to 800. So let's change the ISO down to 800. Now when I change the aperture back to f22, I'm back to my 1/100th of a second. And if we take that picture, by using that f22, we'll have a slightly reduced amount of depth of field, but it should be sharper because of the fact we're not into that diffraction area that the lens and aperture combination has given us. Now the difference between the fully auto and the fixed ISO is that if you're using a fixed ISO, the camera just adjusts the aperture and shutter speed combination depending on the amount of light that's entering the camera. Now you can see with the ISO that I've got set on the camera at the moment of 800, the shutter speed is 1/800th at f10. Now if I wanted f20 for more depth of field, if I turn the top control dial to give me f20, my shutter speed drops to 1/200th. So if we take that shot, we'll get that amount of depth of field, but you notice now when I take the shot again, my shutter speed and aperture combination have gone back to default of f11. Now if I wanted to lock in the combination that I set, so if I want to use f22 for a series of shots, then I need to press the star button on the side of the camera. So up on the left hand side you'll notice there is a star. Press that and that appears here on your LCD, which means that that combination will be locked. So now when I take the shot and go back to shooting again, you'll see that it's held that combination of 1/200th and f/22. So we can take as many shots as we want and it will keep that combination for us. To release the lock on the exposure and aperture, just press the star button again and then it will go back to normal metering and exposure for you. Now again, in this semi-automatic mode, it's dependent on the metering of the camera to give you the right exposure. So again, it can be fooled by scenes which are relatively dark behind your subject or light behind your subject. And again, you can use exposure compensation to adjust the way that the camera is giving you the exposure. So if I thought this image was slightly underexposed, I can use exposure value compensation just by clicking into it, and then I can use that front control dial to set up, say, 2/3 of an EV positive. Press set, and then you can take the picture with that exposure value compensation applied. And of course, if you wanted to use that in combination with your fixed aperture and shutter speed, you use a star combination. So if I wanted f/16, press the star, that will lock it in, and it will lock it with the exposure value compensation that I apply. So for each shot now, we will have that f/16 with 1 EV applied. If you release the lock on the aperture and shutter speed, the exposure value compensation remains, as that's a manual process. If you wanted to go back to 0 EV, just click into your exposure value compensation and return that to 0 and press set to give you the same shooting conditions. Now, we've been talking about metering quite a bit in this tutorial, so metering is an important element of getting the correct exposure. So it's important to recognize which type of metering mode to use for your particular scene. Now, the camera does support 4 methods. One which they call evaluative, which means it's using the whole of the screen to evaluate the subject to background ratio. There's one using partial, which is a smaller area of that screen. Spot metering, which uses even a tinier amount, and then there's a center weighted average. So let's have a look at those in operation and how it affects our exposure. Now, the quickest way to get into setting up the metering mode for your shot is to use the quick menu. So if you touch Q on the screen, notice the options you can get with the Q menu. We want the one over on the left hand side, which is the one that's currently highlighted, metering mode. So it gives you the options of using the center weighted average, which is just 2 brackets, the spot metering, which is the small dot, the partial metering, which is a slightly bigger area, and the whole area or evaluative. So if I set to spot metering and then return, you might just be able to see on the image here is a small black circle, and that indicates the amount of area that the image is being used to calculate the exposure. So for example, if you've got a subject which is of normal brightness, but you're against a very bright or a very dark background, you can use spot metering to evaluate the exposure based on the subject, and it won't be influenced by the amount of darkness or lightness in your background. So if we look at the exposure that this spot metering is taking, it's given me 1/1000th of a second at f/13. If we go into the center weighted option, then it's using a much larger area, but it's taken into consideration some of the background. So if we look at the exposure now, it's still giving us that 1/1000th f/13. So the background really isn't influencing this at all. It looks to be about the same tonal range. If we again look at the other metering modes, we go into partial metering. That gives us a slightly bigger circle than the spot metering one, so I should imagine this is going to give us the same 1000 at f/13. And the final metering mode, which is the evaluative, which is using the whole screen, so it's taking into consideration the subject and the background to determine the exposure. So if we have a look at the exposure for that one, it's given us 1000 at f/11. So it's saying the background is a little bit darker, so I'm going to increase your exposure by opening the aperture a little bit to f/11 from f/13. So the metering mode will really depend on your subject size and the ratio between the subject and your background brightness. It is the best way that I can identify which method to use. Now the way I can demonstrate this is by looking at a wider scene. So I've now brought the lens back to about 30mm from the 150mm. So the owl now is smaller in the frame, and say I wanted to get the exposure right for that owl. Now if I'm using the evaluative method, which is currently set up, the exposure is giving me 1/320th at f9. We'll take that shot and have a look at it in the video, and you'll notice that we've probably lost a little bit of highlight detail in the owl. So if we switch over to spot metering, and I go to spot metering selection there, have a look at the exposure. It's showing me that I'm 1/400 at f11. Let's take that shot first of all. Now here a little bit of common sense comes into play. It is a predominantly white subject, so again that is going to fool the metering circuit, and I would be using some form of positive exposure value compensation to correct for that. So knowing this is white, I would probably use something like 0.7 of an EV to compensate for that. So let's have a look at the exposure, 1/400 at f10. Let's capture that shot, have a look at it in the video, and you can see the background now is much brighter, but we still got detail in the owl in the foreground. So that is one indication that, again, it's the subject to background ratio that will be determining the exposure. Well, that's it for this video on the program auto mode, and I hope you found that useful. In the next video we'll be looking at the aperture priority and shutter priorities, or the AV and TV mode as they're called on the Canon series of cameras. So I look forward to bringing you that video in the not too distant future. So if you're a new viewer to the channel and haven't yet subscribed, please do click that subscribe button and the bell notification icon so you'll be warned when I upload the new videos in this series. Also check out my photographic blog, and I'll put a link to that in the video description below. You'll find lots more information on the Canon mirrorless cameras and in photography in general. And on the home page is the application to join my newsletter group. It goes out to something like 2,900 people now every 3 weeks. It's more than a newsletter, it's a photographic journal in many respects. So please do check that out if you've not already subscribed to it. So as usual, thanks very much for watching. Please do take care, and I hope to see you all in my next video. Goodbye for now.